Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to take a look at another brilliant Emory Tate game. This was played in the Chicago Open in 1997. With the white pieces was Eduard Zelkind, and with black we had Emory Tate. And we're going to look at it from the black perspective today. So let's just get straight into it. So white played e4. Tate played his usual Sicilian, c5. White played knight c3, and there was g6. And we get into a closed Sicilian position with g3 here. Bishop g7 was played, bishop g2. Both sides fianchetting their bishops. Tate played d6. Standard stuff so far with d3. So white's idea is now just to play moves like f4, knight to e2, bishop to e3. And black just continued normally as well with knight to c6. And as we expected, bishop to e3 was played. Tate played bishop to d7. It was queen d2. A very flexible move, eyeing up the h6 square if the knight moves from g8. White may also castle queenside in this position. But now Tate played a very unusual move. On move 7, he played the move b5. Quite shocking actually. Offers up a free pawn. So this knight on c3. We're very tempted to take this. So what happens if knight takes b5? Well, actually, this is actually considered the best move by the engine. And I think white should have just got in for this because he doesn't look too bad after bishop takes b2. White can play rook to b1. The bishop drops back to g7 and white can play knight to e2. And the engine gives this as fairly equal for both sides. So all that's happened is they've swapped off b-pawns and white can no longer castle queenside. But in the game after b5, if your opponent played this against you, I think you'd be rather shocked. And it looks like a weird gambit, so maybe this is why white didn't take this off. But I think this was a fatal error, because now white continued normally with knight to e2. And Tate just continued to push his pawn, b4. Hits the knight on c3. Forces it to move away. It goes back to d1, which does defend the b2 pawn. So no material is gained. But now the engine considers that black has the edge and the slight advantage here out of the opening. With Tate now playing h5, preparing to play h4 and launching pawns on both sides of the board. It's hard to know where white should castle here. So h3 was now played by white. This is usually a typical idea if someone launches their pawn up the board. Usually the idea is that if black now did play h4, which is obviously bad, white can just respond with g4 and has not compromised their position. After h3 though, Tate continued with queen to c8. Again, he's being very flexible as well. He gets his queen on this c file. Might prepare a c4 push at some point, but I think the main idea is to eye up the h3 square. Stops white from castling or moving his rook on h1. The next move played was white's playing f4. So white does have a big space advantage in the centre. Tate just developed though, knight to f6. And white manoeuvred their knight around to f2. So that was the point of f4, to give f2 the space and a square to the knight, which now protects h3. White can now decide to castle either way. Tate though continued to put some pressure on white's position. He played a5. So supporting his b4 pawn, but also maybe saying to white, if you castle queenside, I'm going to start launching these pawns up the board. So you've got to make a good decision. Now, whilst I was looking at this position, I did wonder, this typically here, you might think e5 looks quite a good move because now the bishop is unleashed. And I looked into this, but it's actually not that good because after pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, white actually loses to knight takes e5. It looks like white just picks up a free rook, but after queen takes a8, suddenly this knight on e5 is going to come in to f3, and there's no really way to stop it. Knight g1 is probably the best idea, but for instance, if like white castled queenside here, there's knight to f3, and all of a sudden the queen is trapped. So after this move, I guess knight g1 is probably the only way to stop f3, and now just bishop c6 looks really good for black, forcing rook h2, and then just comes h4. And it's very difficult, so let's say g4, it's just difficult for white to defend this position. after a move like c4, and we can see the bar just encroaching here. It's plus or minus. It's -3 for black, so a very strong position. So yeah, that's why after a5, don't play e5 in this position. Just terrible. But I was just looking at it because it looked like a natural move. Instead, white now played rook to b1, protecting his b2 pawn. Bishop to e6, so from Tate. So every time white makes a move, Tate decides to make a move that threatens a pawn. So the rook just moved from the a file, which was protecting a2, and now the bishop attacks a2. Very annoying when your opponent does this sort of thing. White played a3 to move his pawn away from the bishop, and Tate played knight to d7. Finally though, white does decide to jump in and castle kingside this time. I suppose he's moved his rook to b1, so he has to move it somewhere. And Tate plays knight to b6. So moves his knight to the other side of the board. The bishop is now raking down the board. It's actually still quite an even game though. White's got a very solid structure. This is really solid, so we'll see now how Tate disrupts this. King h2 as well, super solid from white. But now comes Tate f5, trying to open up the centre of the board. White takes on b4 first, and black recaptures. Black's now got the open file, which is very nice and handy. And white now makes an aggressive move in the centre with e5. Probably a mistake as well. We've considered e5 earlier, and now e5 is played on the board. It just looks a bit suspect, mainly because now black actually has a really good move with just bishop to d5, and if takes on d6, takes on d6, rook e1 and king f7, we see black actually has the advantage, and it's because the rook's going to swing into e1, attack and harass this bishop. White's pieces are very clogged up and not really well coordinated. If you could pick the squares, you ideally would want a knight on f3 here, but the way they're situated is just very awkward for white to deal with, hence why black is considered to be winning here. So after e5 though in the game, Tate went hyper aggressive and played h4, trying to crack open the king side and open up white's king to this rook. White played c4 though. This was a very unusual move. You'd think that white would go into defensive mode, but instead plays c4, trying to block up and lock up the position. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but now black just opens things up with d takes e5. So black's won a pawn on e5, sacrificing his c5 pawn. White takes on c5, and now comes h takes g3 with check. So white has to take that off, and in the game he decided to take it off with the king, which again looks very unusual. Why is knight takes considered bad? Well, I think it's because after this move you can take on f4, forcing the knight to go back to e2. Well, why is this considered bad? Well, because apparently f3 is just incredibly strong in this position, because after bishop takes f3, there's this move, knight to e5. Hits the bishop. The queen is now hitting the bishop on c5 too. If bishop takes a8, then queen takes a8. And knight to f6, knight to f3, sorry, is threatened. Queen has to move to e3. And then just knight to f3 anyway, check. King to g3. And there's a very nice move, knight to h4. Threatening queen to g2 with checkmate. And black's in a very strong position, and controlled the game comfortably if this happened. So after h takes g3, white doesn't take with the knight because we just saw it loses. Instead, king takes g3. But surely this is helping black though, because the king's just out in the open a bit here. Now in the game, Tate played knight to d7, but as we said, the king's out in the open. So I think maybe e takes f4. It just looks really good here. After knight takes f4, you've got the amazing move g5, and all of a sudden, black's position looks very scary to white. Let's say knight takes e6, and then you can get a piece into the game. Bishop to e5 stops the king escaping away, forces the king to f3, and then queen takes e6, bishop takes knight, and then just bishop f4, and black's actually considered better here, even if it's ever so slightly. Don't get me wrong, it's an absolutely messy position, take a long time to analyse, but we're just going through it quite quickly. So maybe for this reason, after king takes g3, Tate didn't want to go in for too many complications. It's probably better to stop this bishop attacking the knight, to be fair, in a lot of variations. So he played knight to d7 first, which does hit the bishop, forcing white to move it away. Plays bishop takes b4. Now he does play e takes f4. E takes f4 with check. And this is probably actually is a better variation, because after knight takes, there's knight takes b4, queen takes b4, rook to b8 to hit the queen drops back to d2, and now queen c7. This pin is absolutely monstrous. It's preparing g5, and there's no real way to stop it. h4 is probably the only way you can stop g5, but then I think you can just play moves like bishop to e5, bishop to f6, and I think bishop to f6 is actually the strongest move here, and you're probably threatening to actually take this with the rook instead and then just try and destroy this f4 knight. Very powerful for black. Back to the game. E takes f4 was played then. White did not take this, as we just discovered. Played king h2, trying to hide his king away, and Tate just solidifies his position with g5. g5 protects f4, also threatens to play moves like g4. A very scary situation for white to be in. For this reason, g4 is the threat. He played king to g1 to unpin the king off the h-file. But now Tate played a centralising move, knight to e5, preparing the move f3. So this knight protects the f3 square once again, and white has to do something about this. Played knight to d1 in the game, so unleashing the rook, stopping this f3 threat, because now two pieces are on it. Right? You'd think so. But no, Tate did actually just play it anyway. Played f3. f3. Straight in. Attacking two pieces. So bishop takes f3 was played. So what is Tate's plan here? Well, the bishop has just moved. It was protecting h3. And black can just smash in with rook takes h3. And now two pieces do attack the f3 square once again. The bishop is forced backwards. And all of a sudden, once the bishop moves, this rook is unlocked and d3 is hanging. Rook takes d3, attacking the queen. White tries to find the best reply, plays bishop takes knight with check. Queen takes is played, and queen takes g5. So the queen attacks the bishop on g7. So how can you defend this? Well, Tate played bishop to f6. A counter-attacking move hits the queen. Queen h5 check is played. Tate moves his other bishop back to f7, and white move there, queen back to h1. I think I was having a look at queen takes f5 as well. Let's see what happens if this is played. Well, the best move is bishop to g6, and white's queen is all of a sudden running out of a lot of squares. Let's say queen to f4. Then the move rook h3 is very strong, because now you're threatening moves like queen to h1 with check, followed by bishop to h4. And white's king is just out in the open. There's no protection whatsoever. And to be honest, this position looks very resignable. I mean, there's even just simple moves like queen to b6 in some variations. So white, I don't think, can survive this. In the game then, instead of taking another pawn, white actually decided to try and defend. So played queen to h1. So got their queen into a defensive position, but Tate finished off the game with a very nice move actually, knight to f3 check. White actually resigned the game after this was played. So let's now check out why they resigned. Well, king f2 is the first one to look at. If king f2 though, we can play bishop to h4. As we discussed in another variation, it stops the king escaping, and it's also a nice check. There's nowhere for this king to go really. Let's say king goes to g2, then queen to g6 is just really strong, followed by mate on g3. In fact, after bishop to h4, probably queen takes h4 is probably the only move, and you'll just lose a whole queen. So after knight to f3, probably one of the other moves that you could play is rook takes f3 is probably another option. But black can just play rook takes f3, winning a whole exchange. If white tries to defend with knight to f2, get another piece in to protect the king, then there's actually a really cheeky move here. It's actually castle's queenside. A very cheeky move to play in this sort of position, because now you're threatening to play rook to g8, followed by moves like bishop to d4, bishop takes c4. It just all looks very good for black. Let's say rook to c1 in this position, rook h8, queen to g2 for instance, and now rook to g8 just picks up the queen. Yeah, white's just in an awful position. So this was the final position, another impressive game by Tate. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of the game. If you did, please consider leaving a comment or a like. It really helps the channel out, and hopefully I'll be able to post more videos soon to help you improve your chess. Thank you for watching, everyone.